welcome back to New World Next Week. I'm James Corbett of CorbettReport.com.
And I'm James Evan Pilato of MediaMonarchy.com. Rideshare services share 12 million users' data. We've got that story, plus the government also worries that this new sharing economy isn't sharing with the government. But first, we've talked a lot about precedent-setting court cases here on New World Next Week, and here's a bad example. James, you tweeted this out a few days ago at Corbett Report. Court rules police can legally make up lies to pull people over to fish around for criminal behavior. The United States Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals specifically recently ruled that police officers can lie to suspects in regards to a traffic stop even when no violation has occurred. The ruling essentially gives police officers carte blanche to stop anyone they want for absolutely no reason, merely acting on a hunch. According to the ruling, quote, so long as the facts known to the officer establish reasonable suspicion to justify an investigatory stop, the stop is lawful, even if the officer falsely cites as the basis for the stop a ground that is not supported by reasonable suspicion, end quote. The court goes on to justify their rights violating and very Stasi-esque ruling by claiming it's okay as long as the officer truly believes the subject of his lies has criminal intent. Continuing, quote, we emphasize, however, that although our focus is on the objectively reasonable basis for the stop, not the officer's subjective intentions or beliefs, the facts justifying the stop must be known to officers at the time of the stop, end quote. The case in question originated out of a federal court in Montana and involved two guys of running meth. So, James, we've learned pretty much everybody loses when you call the cops, but what the hell are you supposed to do when the cops essentially come calling on you?
Good question. Well, I mean, once you get into legal land, I mean, you know, it's a whole different universe. And, I mean, what does this actually mean? The cops have always been able to lie and get away with it in court. They can just say, oh, I thought I smelled marijuana. So, or, you know, whatever they say. And what court is going to say, I don't think you're telling the truth, officer? So they've always, I mean, this has always been there to some extent. I think what this ultimately means is this is the formalization, the outright rubber stamping of, hey, we are above the law. We are the law. You know, anything we say goes. We are judge, jury, executioner. And that's, I mean, that is worrying because that's another huge step towards the police state. It's, again, only a mental step. It's only a step in paper and formality. But when they start formalizing the fact that they can make anything up to pull you over, that's when you start to realize, I mean, this is an outright, overt, they want it in your face police state.
And in funny ways, it seems almost like it's ancient history, but I can't help but think of something like John Yoo in this situation, just sort of saying, well, you know, it depends on, you know, why the cops thought he needed to torture that kid in front of his parents. It's all been happening. They just need to put it down on paper. So if perhaps some sort of world court situation comes up in the perhaps not too distant future, they know they've already CYA'd and that they've already covered their asses and wrote it into law. Our second story, James, Uber passed 12 million users' data to law enforcement in 2015. And we grabbed this story, I believe, from Activist Post. In the last 6 months of 2015, Uber received 415 requests from U.S. law enforcement for passenger or driver data related to criminal probes, the ride-hailing company said in a transparency report. Uber gave U.S. agencies data on 12 million people overall. The company fully complied with nearly 32% of law enforcement requests and partially complied with nearly 53%, while 15% of requests were withdrawn by law enforcement or the company found no data to offer, according to this first Uber transparency report, which includes info the company gave to comply with transportation regulations and airport reporting requirements. The company said it never actually got an NSL, or National Security Letter, or FISA, for an Intelligence Service Act order, which are typically reserved for national security or intelligence investigations involving communication service providers. James, would it be crazy to suggest that some companies would just say no to this?
No, it wouldn't. And it shouldn't be a strange thing to suggest something like that. The point here is how many of these requests were actual search warrant requests and how many were just requests. And I don't know, I don't have that number off the top of my head, but I know they weren't all actual search warrants. So if this company was actually interested in even just maintaining the actual letter of the law, they would only have to reply to the actual search warrants, not the can we please have this data on 12 million users kinds of requests. But I understand why an Uber or an Airbnb is doing it. It's because they are trying to play nice in order to get into the system, to get into the club, because, obviously there are a lot of powerful interests against them. I think this is the worrying inflection point of some of these great ideas of peer-to-peer economy type of things that are becoming formalized, becoming institutions, becoming what they were fighting against. And if you want to be with the big boys, if you want to play in that monopoly system, if you want to have the, become the next taxi cab monopoly kind of thing, well, you're going to have to play ball. So they're showing that they play ball, and that's what this is about. I think, again, the real point of this is not that the peer-to-peer economy is somehow defunct or wrong or we have to abandon it. It's that these big companies are getting too big for their britches. We need more little upstarts, competitors. Use the alternatives. Again, don't get on Facebook and Twitter and the big, search engines and Google and whatever, because as soon as you start centering around the same big companies, they're going to become the new monopolies and become just as bad or even worse than the old ones. And I think that's the point of this.
And in a lot of ways, that might actually be the story we're laying out on this episode 265 of New World Next Week. James, I just double-checked. It was an activist post. That story was coming from Russia Today, and it's worth noting that only 90 out of that 450 were via a required search warrant. So again, getting exactly to your point, most of those requests then are, gosh, please, could we have that info? Our third and final story this week, James, might we file under a not unmitigated good news story. And it's another one from Bloomberg. It's story time from Bloomberg. Every time Ian Haynes rents out his spare room in the Australian port city of Albany, Airbnb takes 13%. Haynes, who's semi-retired, uses the extra money to supplement his income running a local farmer's market. He says he's careful to pay taxes on the Airbnb money because the San Francisco company may report the transactions to the Australian government. For Airbnb, things are different because it manages its finance via units in Ireland and tax havens like the Channel Islands. Only a small part of its share of the revenue is ever likely to be taxed by Australia or the U.S. A review of Airbnb's overseas regulatory filings show it has a far more extensive web of subsidiaries than it has publicly acknowledged, more than 40 in all. That's the challenge that Airbnb, like Uber and other companies in the so-called sharing economy, poses for the world's treasuries. Now, again, remember, this is coming from Bloomberg. In the 5 years since these businesses began their spiraling growth, some cities and states around the globe have fought hard to make them play by the same rules as traditional hotels or taxis and collect various local taxes. Often as not, they've lost. As the new breed of companies move towards profitability, transforming larger chunks of the economy, policy experts say the battle is likely to shift to the national level, where billions of dollars a year in corporate taxes could be at risk. Stephen Shea, a former top international tax lawyer at the U.S. Department of the Treasury, now teaches at Harvard, and he has this very interesting quote. These companies are the future. The nature of their business and the structure of the companies can allow them to essentially keep all their profits out of the U.S. Unless the tax systems find a way to deal with this, the lost revenue may be enormous, end quote. And now we get to, James, what you were just speaking about. For years, pharma and tech companies like Pfizer, Merck, Google, Apple have slashed their U.S. federal tax bills by using offshore tax havens and shifting profits abroad. Airbnb and Uber are starting to extend their strategy, or rather this strategy, across vast new fields. PricewaterhouseCoopers estimates that the sharing economy businesses generated $15 billion in revenue in 2014 and will take $335 billion by 2025, growing largely at the expense of companies that pay billions in U.S. taxes. Now, offshore has all the rage, James. So in this way, do we kind of cheer that some of this offshore booty might actually benefit the so-called little guy?
Well, yes. I mean, the point of this story from Bloomberg is clearly part of the propaganda rollout of now we need some sort of global tax agreement. What can we possibly do with all these companies shifting money around? Because it's all online and it's part of this scary sharing economy. So clearly this is a propaganda piece. And I think that is illustrated literally most effectively by the illustration in this article, which is ridiculous. The most ridiculous illustration I've ever seen in any news article ever. And we'll put it on screen for people who want to see it, because it is just stupid. And it's all just part of the vilification of the sharing economy and things of that nature, because you can't tax them. You can't get your clutches into it. Oh, won't someone think of the taxes? I think this goes back, as you say, to the point we were making in the last story, is that Airbnb and Uber and whatever are becoming just the big new monopoly giants. And the point of this, really, again, is that in the peer-to-peer economy, the real peer-to-peer economy where we can transact with each other directly, it is agoristic in nature. You can get around taxes and things like that if you want to. And that's why this is a scary proposition, and that's why they're rolling out the propaganda right now to try to get everyone on board, because, oh, what will we do if we can't get our treasury clutches in there? You won't be able to have healthcare or whatever. They're going to try to promise the goodies to people who want to get those tax talons sunk further into the flesh of the average consumer.
And they would carry away the cat that's in that awesome illustration. James, I think the optimist in me maybe hopes that the difference maybe between things like Pfizer and Google doing this versus Airbnb and Uber is that Airbnb and Uber are more of the peer-to-peer economy, and that they can be an idea or even an ideal, whereas I don't know that anybody can move forward using the services of Google and Skype or Twitter or any of those things. But when you use the idea of peer-to-peer and eliminating the middleman and using the idea of sharing a ride or selling your vegetables, that I think really is going to become sort of the unstoppable thing. So that is a little bit of good news. And if you want a little bit more good news, I've been doing weekly Good News Next Week episodes. The latest one is called A Fridge Full of Free Food. You may have seen the story about a restaurant in India that put a fridge outside meant for food that would otherwise go to waste. You put it in there and it's free for hopefully the people who need it the most. Another good news story submitted to us using hashtag Good News Next Week at Ray Vahey noted some ISPs are actually refusing to disconnect so-called pirates. And the classic hashtag New World Next Week, some of the other stories we've been watching, and an update, of course, on a story we've reported here. FBI paid a professional hacker a one-time fee to crack the San Bernardino iPhone. The mainstream celebrates as Greece forced to go cashless, and Goldman and Wells Fargo finally admit that they committed fraud. So, James, that's all the news I got for you on this New World Next Week. Anything else you'd like to add?
No, I think that'll be a nice wrap-up in the department of things we already knew several years ago, but and now it's finally being confirmed. Anyway,
that's it.
Yeah,
it's being
that's kind of the story of New World Next Week. We report it, and you'll see it in the news a few years from now. All right, I think we'll leave it there. James, thanks again for the stories.
All right, buddy. Thank you.